So thank you for joining me here today. Today we're covering Alteryx for the SQL user. My name is Joe Miller, and I'm a product trainer here for Alteryx. Who I have with me here today is Nathan Flugel. He's also under the alias of Alteryx Services or Training Services. Throughout the duration of this course, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A section. We've already had a few Q&As come in already. Feel free to go ahead and enter them there, and then I will take breaks periodically throughout the course to either answer them, or Nathan may go through and answer them on his, when he seems fit, when he deems it fit. So feel free to ask any questions there. Currently, everybody's muted, so I won't hear anybody if they try to talk up. We just do that to keep the background noise down to a minimum. Okay. So today's agenda, we're going to go through just real quickly some of the upcoming trainings that we have coming up here. We're going to give you some background on what we're going to be doing today, and then we're going to actually go into the designer training, and then finally we'll finish off with some of the support options that you have available. Upcoming trainings, as many know, every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, we have a demonstration that lasts about an hour. This week is Alteryx for the SQL user. There are two more remaining in July. There's just a simple getting started with Alteryx Visual Workflows. That's another beginner's course. Then if you're interested, we have a course coming up on fuzzy matching, which has to deal with combining two separate data sources that might not be one-for-one exactly the same. So think of things like people's addresses. People might write them in different ways, but how do you actually detect it's the same address? You can find that out in this course, Introduction to Fuzzy Matching. Upcoming in August, we have other trainings like the favorites tools, so if you just want to learn about that palette. On August 9th, we'll be covering a new tool to 10.5, the data cleansing tool, and understanding how to parse that apart and make it a little bit more customized to fit your needs. The 16th, we have data types. The 23rd, we talk about financial functions. And then finally, on the 30th, we've got our fourth series to that intro course, the blending data with Alteryx. One mention to call out before we get going is the Alteryx community. The Alteryx community is a great place for everybody to share some of the answers to their problems or even ask questions about their problems. You'll see that there's a forum on data preparation, connecting to data sources, predictive analytics, where you can ask your questions, and then either somebody from the user community or an Alteryx employee, him or herself, will go in and actually answer your question. What I've found is that if it's a relatively simple question, you'll see an answer to your question within 30 minutes typically based on the responsiveness of the community. So I recommend that if you're looking for a quick answer and you want to be able to share some of your problems, go to the community. We have ways to attach some of your fake data. We have ways to share workflows. So some people might be able to actually create a solution for you and send it to you. So definitely check out the Alteryx community. Also, what we have on there is a series of blogs from some of the experts. Some of our developers say what's really underlying our tool. And then also we have a section where you can submit your ideas. So if you'd like to see a specific function or feature added to Alteryx, go ahead and submit them to the ideas page, and you'll see them go under review by our products team, and they'll decide whether or not it has a place in the next release based on popular vote. So definitely check out the community. I can't speak highly enough of it. It's growing more and more every day, and it's just a lot of traffic going through there. Okay, so let's jump into today's training. Alteryx for the SQL user. So what does that mean? Okay, so for most of us who are coming into Alteryx, we know how to work with data concepts. We know how to write in SQL. We write SQL every day of our lives. That's great. But when you get to Alteryx, it's a little different. So for us, it might not be so much an exercise in understanding how to manipulate data or how to work with data. It might be more of an understanding of how to jump over to a new tool and understand it from the context of what we previously know. So in this course, what we're aiming to do is learn the fundamentals of Alteryx and learn how they might pertain or relate to SQL. So for lack of a better word, if I come up across a tool, I can say, hey, this is your where statement inside of SQL. This is your select statement. I can relate to you maybe on how to write an Alteryx workflow as you might write SQL code. By all means, this is intended to be a beginner's course. It's the first time maybe stepping into the tool, and you're just trying to say, how do I relate MySQL to my understanding of Alteryx? The other thing that I want to make perfectly clear is that this is a course on the translation of SQL to an Alteryx workflow. By no means today are we planning to generate SQL queries out of our workflow. What we're purely trying to do is take an example SQL query. We're going to look at it and build a workflow that essentially replicates it so you can see them side by side. What is SQL query here doing, and how do we accomplish that with a workflow? Here's a quick snapshot of the workflow that we'll be running through today. The processes covered will basically cover all the basic statements of a SQL clause, the select, from, join, where, having, and group by. At the end, if you have any questions on other SQL statements, we can cover those. But those are the main basics that we want to make sure to get out the door. So all the tools that are going to be related to that, and you'll see them down at the bottom, are tools like the input data, join, summarize, filter, and select. Now, I think before we ever talk about this in Alteryx, there's always got to be a discussion that leads into Alteryx versus SQL. For me, I wrote SQL pretty frequently over the past few years, and there are definitely some benefits to working in Alteryx over SQL. First thing that I'd like to talk about is repeatability and being able to work with your team on a certain process. So for example, if I went in and wrote this awesome SQL query, 1,000 lines long, it does its job perfectly, that's great. I accomplished something that I was setting out to do. However, if I were to go out and take that SQL query and hand it off to a teammate of mine, the real issue becomes is that no one knows how to manage that SQL query. No one knows what I was thinking. It's poorly documented. It's long. It's nested. People don't understand really the logic that's going on because they cannot see the way the data is being manipulated. Usually what typically happens is people are going to say, oh, I have to parse out pieces of this SQL statement to see how it goes step by step. Well, luckily for Alteryx, we already build in a step-by-step fashion. So it takes down the time for you to discern what somebody else did within some sort of data analysis. And that's a really powerful thing because a lot of times we spend time trying to troubleshoot. And that can take a long time if we're working on somebody else's code. But I've found within Alteryx, it might be a little easier. The second thing that I want to mention is the data is art. Okay. Sometimes we tend to be a little bullish and a little abusive towards our data. And that's sometimes what it feels like inside of SQL. We're trying to fit something in a certain way and we push our data around. But sometimes in that idea of being bullish around our data and pushing it into a certain idea, we're also missing a certain fraction of the data that might be important to us. We're not looking at the whole picture. And I think that's another thing that becomes really valuable when you're working within Alteryx. So here in this screen, in this slide here, I've shown you 3 different visualizations. The first one is the FedEx logo, the Toblerone, which is a chocolate candy logo, and some NFL teams. Okay. Let me give you guys a second and look at each of these and say, how might I look at this in a different way than I typically do? For FedEx, you might just see the word FedEx, but really it's actually an award-winning logo that's won tons and tons of marketing logos because it has almost a subliminal message in it with this arrow showing that how fast they deliver and how they're always pointed towards progress. Some of you may not have known that existed there, but actually the EX makes the shape of an arrow. So whenever you look at that on the street next time, check it out. A second one, Toblerone. The Toblerone chocolatiers actually come from a European city called the City of Bears, and they've actually inserted their little mascot into the mountain of Toblerone. So there's another picture that you might be missing. Finally, we have a list of NFL teams. Okay, what is different about one of these teams that none of these other teams have? The answer, in my head, is the Eagles logo. You certainly could find things that are different about each of them. But this one is different in the sense that it's the only one that faces to the left if it's not symmetrical. So the Colts one would be symmetrical, but everybody else has a logo that faces to the right. The Eagles one is the only one that faces to the left. Why is that? That's because they want to make the letter E with the neck of the eagle. So they actually flip the logo in order to kind of purvey some sort of data. All right. So that's something that I really want to talk about. Is don't only think about what you're shooting for, but also what you're missing and talking holistically about your data. So let's jump inside the workflow and talk about what tools we're going to be working with today. The first one is the input data tool. Very easy, something that we always work with inside of SQL. This is essentially your select all from, okay? That's all this statement is. It's the tool that connects to your data, connects to all the fields, and brings them all into memory inside of Alteryx, okay? Now you will notice that we have a record limit capability, which is akin to the top and limit statement within a SQL. So if I were to say limit top 500, okay, you could go in here and you'll see within the configuration of my input data tool with my number 1 option there within my configuration, I have a record limit. By default, nothing is sent. When nothing is sent, it's essentially an asterisk, or essentially saying all of the records within my data set. If I want to bring in 100, just punch in the value of 100 there, and it'll be great to go, okay? So this is an example of me just connecting to something called legislators CSV, okay? So let's go in here. I'm going to jump into my canvas, and we're going to replicate what we've just done here. One thing to mention before I actually get into the workflow itself is what we're going to be building towards, okay? So what I'll show you here, see if I can zoom up on it a little bit there. This is a SQL statement that I have today. This is really what I want to do. Now, I might have people on my team that aren't as proficient writers of SQL than me. They might not understand this as well. It's a little bit harder to visualize, but I really want to create this process. When I look at this, if I'm a SQL user, I tend to think inside out, right? We tend to work with the sub-selects first and then move up to the actual outside shell. So the first part that I'm going to work on is to select all from current legislators. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do is create this section of my statement. So I'm going to go into my input data here, bring an input data tool. I'm going to search for my file. And give me a second while I actually connect to the correct file here. There you go. So I've connected to my legislators file. You can see it's legislators current. I have no record limit on it. I can choose to set my delimiter if that's a certain case or not. But you'll see below I have a sample of data of my first 100 records. In this case, I don't even have 100 records. It's the first 52. Had I had more, it would have given me a sample of the first 100. Okay. What if I had put a record limit on it? You can see by limiting it to the top 10, I'm only getting the top 10 records back. So that's something I can choose to set, even if it's not important for me in a production environment. At the very least, I could use it for maybe just my development purposes. Maybe I don't want to bring in 1 million records every time. So certainly, I could set a limit there. So I've got my legislators current. And then finally, I'm going to connect to one other file. And this one's going to be called Bill Summary 114. Essentially, we're going to do an analysis on legislators and who passed bills, who didn't pass bills, who sponsored bills, okay, and what state had the most sponsored bills. That's really what we want to get to. That's what our SQL statement was saying. That's where we want to be at with our files. So first, I'm going to connect to them, file browse, and connect to my bills summary. So essentially here, I have a select all from legislators current, select all from bills summary 11. Let's go back over to our statement over here. Okay. So you can see that what I'm doing for that bill summary 114 is I plan on left outer joining that to my current legislators. So I want to left outer join to my legislator current, okay? And I want to join them both on GovTrack ID, where the type is equal to rep, okay? And this really should be a.type equal to rep. This is from my current legislators table. But first, I want to do a little bit of cleanup before I do my join, and this is where it can get really, really, really painful within SQL, and it's one of the greatest benefits of Alteryx is this select tool right here. Okay, so let's go in here and work with our select tool. Now it's named select because that's very familiar with us, for us who have worked within database environments. Within a select tool, we can do something like specify fields that we want within our data set. We can cast certain data types. We can rename fields with some sort of alias. That's exactly what we're doing with our select tool. And also, we can order it, right? The order in which we enter something into a select statement is the order it will appear as the resulting data set. So that's all that I'm doing in this case. So let's go through, and I'm going to say what fields that I don't want within this data set, or I don't want to pass any further. Essentially, everything that I've checkmarked is something that I'm literally writing into my select statement. So I'm going to deselect birthday, gender, and then I'm going to go in and deselect URL. And I'm going to deselect the whole span. So I'm going to highlight a whole grouping, go to options, deselect highlighted fields. I'm going to keep GovTrack ID, and then that will be it. I'm going to deselect this grouping too. Now, think about this one example, and I know how painful it can be for all of us who have written SQL before. Imagine you're working with a data set with 100 different fields. Have you ever been in a scenario where you just want 95 of those 100 fields? Certainly, I think most of us have been there at one point. We go from that piece of writing just select star, just to grab that 100, to having to literally spell out 95 different fields in order to only capture those within our resulting data set. Extremely painful. Incredibly painful. One thing that's often overlooked with Alteryx, though, that is lost within this SQL functionality is this last field right down here at the bottom called unknown. What is unknown? For those of you who are not familiar with unknown, unknown represents any possible future structural tables or table changes. So for example, if I was connecting to a table today that only had 5 fields, right, and I have unknown selected and it turned to 6 tomorrow, do I want to automatically select that 6th field, or do I want to automatically deselect it? If we go back to our scenario where we had to name 95 out of the 100, we are only ever going to select that 95 out of 100, no matter what new fields come in at the end. We have to go back in and change it if anything dynamically changes. Here, we at least give ourselves the opportunity to specify the fields that we want, and at the same time, account for future changes, which is something we can't say within a select statement. So it's a really powerful functionality, and it can do things really quickly. Okay. Another great example is how quickly we can cast things. Okay, so let's go over to our other tool down here, Bill Summary. And let's say we want to work with changing some data types. I'm going to bring in a select down here, deselect the whole group that I don't want. So I'm going to say everything above district I don't want. And then I have all this information around sponsored bills, amendments, co-sponsored, withdrawn bills, etc. I do want to keep GovTrack ID because that is something that I will be doing my left outer join on down the line. So let's keep that in there for now. But with sponsored bills and below, I want to change that data type. By default, when we're connecting to a CSV, Alteryx likes to bring things in as a vString, or if you're working with a database environment, a varchar. That's essentially the equivalent. But we know if we want to do any sort of quantitative capabilities within any of these fields, we're going to have to convert those fields into numbers. So you might cast it as an integer within SQL, which again gets really tedious casting each of these fields. Within Alteryx, I could just go into the drop down here, select any sort of value. So I'll just say int 16, and I already changed them that quickly. And again, I could also highlight a whole range, just like I did before, by selecting Shift and then clicking within the range. Options, change types of highlighted fields, and then going to int 16. Relatively painless. So that's another really big advantage, is how quickly you can really crank out some of these select statements without having to worry about actually individually writing each one of those. Let's revisit our presentation here now. So again, within our select tool, just to recap, we can either select or deselect what appears there. We have essentially that cast ability within our type field. If we do choose something like vstring, and you might specify some sort of length, you can see that we have the size of field available to you to specify some sort of size. And then finally, if you had some sort of alias, like I say, last name as last, I could just say last in my rename column. It would automatically rename that. Now, again, you can reorder fields by just highlighting them and using the arrows to justify them where you want them in the data set. Or you could right-click and drag them to where you want them to be, which might be a little quicker. And then finally, we had that discussion about that unknown field, about passing or restricting future fields changes or any structural changes. Okay. The next thing we want to do is talk about, I think I'm actually going to jump out here and choose a different slide. I think we missed it here. There we go. Is the filter tool. The filter tool is essentially our where statement. The only difference is, and this is where we get back into that whole discussion of negative space, is that when we write a SQL statement, we're only searching for what's true, always and forever. We're only forcing our point of view on it. However, in Alteryx, we allow you to do analysis on both the true and false. Now, we certainly won't carry the false data any further than we don't need to, but you have the opportunity to go back and tap into that false output and rewrite something to it right away without having to alter your query, which is something really powerful. So if I go back into my statement here, we've gotten to the point where we've selected all from current legislators, we've brought in bill summary, cleaned up the fields that we wanted. Now we just need to filter our current legislators where the type is equal to rep. So I can go in here to my filter tool, create that where statement. Now the important thing to know is when creating your where statement, there's two ways to throw it. You can either do a basic filter or a custom filter. If your where statement was so simple that it only needed one conditional statement, go to basic filter. If it's more complex and has substrings and has multiple conditions, you'll want to toggle over to custom filter. And in the custom filter selection, it allows you to choose different variables and different fields in order to build that statement. So you can see down here, by creating a basic filter, we're actually secretly under the covers actually writing some sort of expression. You can see that type equals rep is my statement. All right, so it exactly mimics what we'd write after a where my type is equal to rep. Let's jump back into our canvas here and plug in our filter tool. We'll go to my basic filter, say type, and you can see my expression down here is already beginning to write. It's equal to rep. Let's run the workflow. Okay, so now if I click on my T output, you can see that my data set only has reps. If I were to go down below, you can see that it's Senate. Okay, so you can see what type is being reflected there. Now that I have filtered those to the way that I want them, let's look at the next thing that we need to do. So I've got my filter taken care of, my select, I've brought in both of these tables. It looks like the only thing I have left to do is to actually join them together. So let's go over to our join slide here and learn a little bit more about our join. The join tool in Alteryx is a little different than you might expect of how join works within SQL. How so? So let's look at this join tool configuration for a second. You can see that we have two options, join by record position or specific fields. More often than not, in fact, most of the time we in SQL talk about joining by specific key fields. So more often than not, you're going to select that one. We do have the option to join by position. So for some reason, row 1 in one data set matched to row 1 in the other data set, and you just join them positionally, we have the option to do that. But in this case, you can see that I'm going to join on govtrack ID equal to govtrack ID, and then I can select what fields I want to come out of this. Okay, so in our case, we might want to deselect one of our govtrack IDs, probably the right one, so we don't get that duplicate field in there. Now, what I will call out is some of the difference in what to expect from the output of the join tool. When we talk about SQL, we usually talk about inner joins, outer joins, left outer joins, and right outer joins, and some cross joins. Okay. The J output of the join tool, you'll see that there's 3 outputs. The J corresponds with the inner join. Okay. So if you ever want to replicate that inner join capability, tap into that output. Now, this is where it gets a little funky within Alteryx compared to SQL. Our L output represents a left inner join, not a left outer join, a left inner join, which is really different. It's something that we're not used to, but it is powerful in the sense that it allows us to filter our left data set on our right data set, and we see people using that all the time. So there has been a large case to keep that around. But if you ever want to replicate a left outer join, I've shown you exactly how to do that here. So you see my left output creating this, essentially this set of data here, my J output creating inner join. What I can do is simply union those 2 outputs together to get my left outer join results. Same thing goes if I was looking at a right outer join. You can see I'm just getting that right inner join here and my inner join here, and I can union those together to create my right outer join output. And just so you know, the way our union tool works is essentially a union all. So that's all that's happening within this process. So this is just a nice visual representation of how that join tool actually works. So let's go back to our canvas here and build that join. I'll bring my join tool in. I'm only interested in this case where it's equal to rep. I'm going to connect these 2, and I'm going to set it where govtrack ID is equal to govtrack ID. You'll see down here I have the ability to change or update any field types if I want, which is great because I don't have to keep scrolling back up to my very first select statement. I could actually just plug it in right here if I realized I didn't want to backtrack all the way. So I'm going to deselect right because I know I've got 2 govtrack IDs and I don't want it to appear twice. The default behavior in Alteryx is to rename one of them in the joins if they have the exact same field name. So you'll see that some of them automatically rename to right, the prefix right, if they are duplicated across both data sets. Okay, so we've got our join. I'm just going to add a few browses after so we can look at each of these outputs. Now you'll see at a very high level, Alteryx does a really great job of actually showing you metadata that's being passed down the connection stream. Let me turn it on permanently for us so we can observe it a little bit closer. So you can see that there's 540 records here. About 100 of them are being filtered out, and only 440 are going into the join on the left side. Over here we have 522, and it looks like only 423 actually joined together. This is a really great, powerful piece, so you don't have to keep doing counts on each of your SQL queries. It allows you to see what's happening at each portion of your actual analysis. You can see in this case there were 17 different legislators that apparently didn't sponsor anything, and then 99 bills that didn't have any sponsor information associated with them. But in this case, we wanted to replicate a left outer join, remember? At this point, we only have a left inner join, an inner join, and a right inner join. So let's create that left outer join. Following this tool, I'm going to drop in a union. I'm going to drag in the 2 data sets that I want to bring together. In this case, my left outer join, right? So my J and my L. I know for a fact that they'll match up on name because they are from essentially the same data set. So I don't have to go through and specify all those union fields, and I can run it. So now you can see I have that data set. You can see here's a couple that had the great left outer, or had a full inner join. Here you can see there was one that was a left outer join, inner joins. So you can see that behavior starting to develop a little bit better now. Now, a few other callouts that I'll make in terms of working with your designer is another consideration for a different join tool that you may have crossed if you hadn't already, and that's the join multiple tool. The join multiple tool essentially allows you to drag in multiple data sets into one join multiple tool versus the other join tool which only allowed a left and a right. Okay. However, there's only 2 types of outputs associated with this tool. there's an inner join between all the data sets. So in this case, I've got Republicans 2013, 2014, or 2012, 2013, 2014, right? And I'm joining them all together. Only reps that exist between all three of these data sets on an inner join will come out this output. Or everybody will throughout this join. So if you ever get to a point where you want to do a full outer join, you have a couple options. So here's this represented visually and how you'd configure that within the tool. Again, you have that same view within the join multiple. You can see that I've put state equal to state for these two data sets in this case. And I've selected this field only output records that join from all inputs. And that replicates my inner join capability. If I have that deselected, then you'll see I've got my full outer join. Now, the important thing to know is that sometimes I recommend to people, especially if they're not familiar with the tool, is how to create a full outer join. Some people only think when two data sets, they only go to the join. When it's two or more, they go to the join multiple. Quite often, I'll actually use the join multiple for only two data sets when I just want the full outer join functionality. So, for example, if I were to go back to my workflow here, let me open it up. I could either accomplish this two different ways. First full outer join could be all these outputs together, the left inner, the J, and the R, which is a series of two tools, correct? Or I could just drag it in from these two data sets and just deselect this on GovTrack-ID to GovTrack-ID, and that also, too, is a full outer join. Only in this case, I've done it in less tools than I've done with these two tools. So that's one advantage to doing a join multiple in this case, even if you only have two data sets. Okay. Delete that, go back to my left outer join. Let's go back to our query and look at that really quick. So now I'm at a point where I've created the data set that should replicate this subquery. Now I want it from this subquery, I want to select the state and average sponsored bills. And of course, when I start working with these summation functions like average, sum, doing any sort of aggregation inside my queries, I'm going to have to work with group bys. And that's required if I have anything outside of an aggregation. So in this case, I'm grouping by state just so I can get the average sponsored bills. Not only am I getting the average, but I'm also looking for a halving statement. So where my average sponsored bills is greater than 13. Then as a final output, I want to take those averages and order them so I've got the highest at top and the least at the bottom. So let's go back into our presentation and see how we can achieve this summation function within Alteryx. What we use inside of Alteryx is called the Summarize tool. You'll see within the Summarize tool, we've got a list of fields, and then a little button called Add. When we select any of these fields, you can click the Add button and choose a certain action to perform on the field. In this case, we wanted to group by state, do an average of the sponsored bills. So what I would do is select state, add group by, then go to sponsored bills, sum or average of sponsored bills. Now, just like a SQL statement, there will be no other fields that come out of the resulting data set than what you've specified in these actions down below. No other fields will pass. So be sure what you have available here does come out inside your data set and is what you want. Okay. Now, I'm only showing a very small subset of what's available within this Summarize tool, but you'll see a lot of aggregation functions or even string functions are available to you. So you could choose to concat fields together. What's the shortest, longest? You could do a variance, a standard deviation, average, mean, median, mode, first, last, count distinct, non-null. I could go on for days. A lot of these functions are bottled up in here. Anything that you could really think of creating inside a SQL. Now, when we get into more intense applications like a formula, then you'd have to look outside of that. But for basic table-level aggregations, you look to the Summarize tool. So let's go ahead and build it within our workflow. So I want to build out of here a summary. And I want to look at each state, so I'm going to do a group by to create that group. And then I want to do an average of sponsored bills. So I'm going to go to add numeric average. And you see that I have the ability to rename these fields in output. Again, if I want to put some sort of alias on these, in this case, I'm really happy with how this looks. So I'm good to go with that. So I'll run that workflow. And you'll see now I've got my average sponsored bills on a state-by-state basis. Now we've gotten to a point where we need to approach our having statement. If you recall from my SQL query, what we had is having an average sponsored amount where it was greater than 13. So in this case, you can look through our data set. Doesn't look like a whole lot. Yep, average sponsored bill is greater than 13. So let's go ahead and try it. And just like a where statement, where we'd use a filter, we would also, for having statement, use a filter. So you don't really have to think of two different things in this case. You can just think of that same functionality of filtering out what you don't want. So I'll bring in a filter, go to my basic filter, average sponsored amounts is greater than 13. Now we obviously can play with this. So I don't have any. You can see that none of them are true in this case. So let's change our number a little bit. I'll just say maybe 1.3. Maybe that was the number that we really wanted to be looking for. There we go. So now we've only got 30 states, right? Average sponsored bill is greater than 1.3. If we toggle back to our query here, we've accomplished essentially all of this now. We just need to be able to order it. What we have for ordering is something called the sort tool. You can choose one or more fields in which to sort, and you can choose to order them based on ascending or descending order. We also do have dictionary order available, and you'll see it down below here. But it is, like SQL, important to know the order in which you select fields to order on. So if I chose state, then county, and ordered them ascending, it's first going to order states alphabetically, then counties within each state alphabetically, versus the other way around. So putting up the precedence and the order within each of these configurations is important. I'm going to drop this into my canvas now. I'm going to go to sort, average sponsored bills, and I'll say descending. Now I'll run that workflow. So now I have each state and the average sponsored bills in the order they were in. Now, what if we wanted to go back and say, we really want the top results of all of these. Really, I'm only interested in looking at the top 5. Now, certainly limiting it at the source would not be helpful because we're only bringing in the top 5 as they exist within the file or the table. Versus here, we could actually set a limit on the order that we found them in this data set. So what I'm going to do is introduce you guys to the sample tool. You can drag and drop that onto your canvas. And you'll see that I can choose a certain parameter that reflects how I want to subsection my data. So let's say, for example, I just have an n value of 5. I could say, give me the first 5 records in this data set, the last 5 records, the 1 in every 5 records, random 1 in 5 chance of each record happening, the first 5%. So I can choose a certain subsection on what I want. In this case, we can just say top 5. I'm going to say the first 5. Run that workflow and look at the output. So now you see I have a data set 6.77, 4.714 for Colorado. So that's their top 5 performers. So now you'll see finally that I've actually replicated this SQL query and more. I've actually added some sort of top value to each of these. Okay, so if I were to go ahead and stack them side by side, and you'll see this within your data that I've been able to send out, see what you've been able to accomplish within Alteryx, and over here on the right, you'll actually see the SQL query that took place. Now, the nice thing is that if I'm not familiar with this workflow, it's much easier for me to go in and say, oh, everything's very visually represented. I can pinpoint the spots that I really want to poke at a little bit more. On top of that, what if I wanted to quickly go into analysis on anybody who is in the Senate? You know what I mean? I don't have to go in and start writing a new SQL query. I could just branch off from my last filter and start looking at everybody who was in a different type. So I don't have to go ahead and rebuild. I already have a starting point already built in for me through all these connections. The final mention that I'm going to make in terms of tools that I think everybody should know is something called the formula tool. I'm going to drag a formula into this canvas. Okay, and what I have here, and this might look a little different from what your formula tool looks like today. It's a bit of a sneak peek of what might be coming out soon. So with this formula tool, I'm going to go in and build some sort of formula. So let's say I want to know what the total of sponsored and co-sponsored bills is for each state. I can create a new field. I'm going to call this total co-sponsored sponsored. And then start building an expression here. So sponsored bills plus co-sponsored bills to create my new value. And this is the one thing that we really left out of what could be available within our select statement is some sort of function, right? In this case, I'm creating some sort of formula that's adding these two fields together. You can see that I have a little preview of what the first value might be within that data set. And all of a sudden, I've actually created a new field available to me to do my analysis on. So if I want to go back and redo my analysis on the total number that were co-sponsored, I could go in there with sponsored and co-sponsored. So really powerful stuff coming out of that tool. Now, certainly this is not limited to just what we have in terms of mathematical functions. I could go in and find things like string functions. So I know a lot of you might be using length functions, left, right, substring, count of words, does it contain, right? That might be an important one where we do look at a where statement where it has a like. You could say where it contains a certain value. So we could go ahead and try that. That's another important thing that I think a lot of people will do, is go in and say where the first name is like, let's see, let's say RTON. I'm going to go in here and filter, go into my functions, and say where my last name contains ARTON. I'll go RTON. So you can see RTON appears in both last names, Barton and Norton. So if you ever get into a place where you start using those percent signs or ampersands or whatever your native database system might be using in order to represent wildcards, you could match it up here. Also, what we have available to you, if you ever get into a more specific case where you want it to start with a B, end with an N, and put a wildcard in between, that wouldn't necessarily work within our contains because that's looking for a single string. We could actually do something like a regex match. So I could go into my string again, regex match, name the string that I'm working on, and name some sort of pattern. So in this case, specify my pattern. I'm going to say it has to start with a B. It can be one or more characters in between. I can have an R in there. I can have one or more characters in between that, and it has to end with an N. So now I've only captured Joe Barton. So that's a way of creating a more verbose way of capturing that like statement within SQL. Okay, so that was the demonstration on replicating a SQL statement within Alteryx. If you have any questions following this course, we recommend that you contact our support resources, especially if we aren't able to answer anything with the Q&A here at the end of the course. So the first place that you can go is the first place that I recommended, community.alteryx.com. It's a really great way to get up and running fast, get like-minded people all on the same page, contributing ideas, problems, answers. Just a great resource. Also, if you go to alteryx.com/product training, more than likely you've already been there because you registered for today's training, but you'll see that there's upcoming training available to you via virtual training. We also have self-paced courses where you could designate yourself as a beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and you could follow some specific educational track according to your skill level. Finally, we've got the technical support. So you can contact our client services at clientservices@alteryx.com. We have live chat available at www.alteryx.com/support. And then we have a phone number for you to call if you really want to contact them directly. More often than not, email is the most effective way because I know a lot of people would like to send their own workflows in and give people client services a really solid example for them to work on. Typically, if they get into a live chat scenario, they might be asking questions more verbally, and it's hard for some of our client services to wrap their heads around if they don't have the full context of the workflow. So feel free to contact client services if there's any questions. At the end of this training, you'll be directed to a survey after this webinar. If you could take a moment to complete it and let us know how we did on this course today. And if there's any courses that you want to talk about upcoming in the future, definitely go to that survey and talk about it there. It's a great way. That's how we base off what future courses are going to be made available, is based on what people really want to see. So feel free to fill that out, and it will definitely help us become better trainers in the future and also hopefully cover more relevant content to you. Thank you for joining today. At this point,